All right, well, hopefully everyone is still surviving their first week of school. Hey, this is Therese from Florida's Positive Behavior Support Project. I am here with Dr. Lauren Ivanovich.
Hello.
And Robin Vanover.
Hi, everyone.
Woohoo! And it is a team effort today.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. So today's topic is behavior basics, prevention, and de-escalation strategies. So strategies to addressing crisis without physical intervention. In the background, preventative approach to restraint and seclusion. Why is it important to take that preventative approach today? We're going to spend some time looking at some data as well. And what does trauma-informed decision-making really mean, and how does that play into de-escalation of behaviors? We're also going to address the acting out cycle and when to intervene, prevention classroom management, and some verbal de-escalation strategies for you. Okay, so at the end, hopefully you're going to be able to identify some resources that can help support those classrooms specifically for preventative strategies. And then we're also going to identify some strategies faculty and staff can use, especially when we're addressing triggers in students and self. Not only just our students, but we have to look at adult behavior as well, and some specific strategies to de-escalate those problem behaviors. So in looking at behaviors, we thought it might be interesting just to take a quick look at the SESA report. And for those of you that aren't familiar, this is the School Environmental Safety Incident Report, and this is from 1718. There are a total of, I believe, 26 incidents of crime, violence, and disruptive behaviors that schools report to their districts and districts report to the DOE. So it's probably one of the more consistent kinds of data collection and records that we have throughout the state. So we were just curious as to how many of those were related to escalating kinds of behaviors. So you can see some of the data there with battery, bullying, disruption on campus. Looking at these 5 top behaviors that we identified that can lead to those escalating kinds of behaviors. And so the data is there for you to look at. But this is really one of the more consistent kinds of data collecting records that we have throughout the state of Florida to take a look at. And then in addition to that, they kind of led us down the next path of, well, gee, what else happens as a result of escalating behaviors among our young adults. And so we look for the civil rights data collection to provide us with some data there as it relates to restraint and seclusion. So in 1516, there were about 86,000 students physically or mechanically restrained, and 36,000 were secluded. And as we know, most of our students that are restrained or secluded are students receiving special education services, yet they represent a really small student enrollment population. So in Florida alone, we're giving you some data there if you want to check that out. In Florida, we have been working as a project to really help support our districts in reducing restraint and seclusion. So all of this is important as we try to collect our data and look at behaviors overall. Now, when we look at restraint and seclusion, one of the things that has been popping up in some of the districts is Baker Act reporting. And so we were curious as to what that looks like in the state of Florida. Many of my districts have a difficult time really gathering some of that data. And so for those of you that have been able to accomplish that task, good for you. For others, you may have a question. Do we keep this kind of data? Is it available to us? What purpose does it serve? So in 1718, for those of you that aren't aware, there's data that gets reported to the Baker Act Reporting Center here at the University of South Florida. And that report is available for you all to take a look at if you choose to, and the link is at the bottom of the slide. But we were curious as to whether or not our state has seen an increase or a decrease, and we have seen an increase in Baker Act reporting. Within just the last 1 year, there was a 10% increase, and some counties and districts actually had significant increases, so more than that 10%. And if we look at over the last 4 years, we see an even more significant increase among our children. And these are our children are under 18, and then we see also the increases for young adults as well. So all of this just to keep in mind when we're looking at those kinds of behaviors that tend to become escalated on our campus, cause fights and disruptions, maybe lead to restraint and seclusion, sometimes leading to Baker Act. So just some things to keep in mind when collecting data. So we'd be remiss today if we didn't at least address a little bit about trauma-informed approaches, because what we know about some of our young folks today is they're entering some of our educational environments, especially our alt centers, with a lot of trauma, but not only at the alt centers, also at our general education population. So we need to become familiar with what kind of a role does this really play with de-escalation strategies, and why is that important for us to be aware of. We know that trauma can be a single event, it can be multiple events, and we all deal with trauma at some point in our lives, but it's the unresolved incidents of trauma that can also lead to some emotional and physical harmful behaviors that can feel threatening to not only the student, but to others around them. So research really found that over 50% of the general population has experienced at least one trauma event in their lifetime. And so what we look at is what's called ACEs, if you're not familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and those are those traumatic events that can have that negative, lasting effect on individuals' health and well-being. Some of those are related to those household challenges, domestic violence, substance abuse in the home, mental illness, sometimes the lack of parental supervision or separation, divorce. We're looking at emotional and physical abuse as well as neglect, both emotional and physical. So all of those things can fall under ACEs. So what happens to some of those kids that are impacted by ACEs? What we know is they have a real difficult time with regulation of emotions. And many of you that are educators can probably think about a situation in which you maybe just went up to a student and just started talking to them about something. Maybe it's just a mild confrontation and everything all of a sudden seems to blow out of proportion. It could be quite simply that this is a child that's being triggered by something, whether it's the adult or maybe it's the situation. But it can also mean that they're just coming to school with this fight or flight kind of feeling, and they're just always in a heightened state of arousal. This can oftentimes interfere with the child's ability to learn, to understand, to interpret, to receive information and store information. So that's why it's important for us to be aware. Some long-term effects and some lasting impacts on our young people that are affected by ACEs can be really long-lasting throughout their lifetime. Not only learning difficulties at the young age, but translating into beyond K-12 education, into college and career and life readiness. So we're looking at substance abuse, potentially we're looking at some anxiety, PTSD disorders, unwanted pregnancies, etc. So some real struggles that can stay with our young people for a long period of time. So we want to ask you right now some questions. So why do you think some situations with students escalate based on your experiences or conversations that you've had with your colleagues? What are some of those situations that take place? Go ahead and type in the chat room.
So as you're starting to type hunger, great, I'll read some as they come out. As folks are sharing, hunger is certainly, hangry is a real thing. Staff interaction, triggers and buttons that can be pushed, fatigue. Thank you for sharing some of those.
Yeah, those are a lot that we've already listed as well.
Feeling disrespected. Oftentimes adults escalate the situations. Yes, Christy, thank you for pointing that out. We're actually going to talk some pretty in-depth about some ways we can address that in a little bit. So we're going to start populating some potential situations that may involve escalation here, and you've covered a lot of them already. Others' reactions to the situation is another. Thank you. Adult tone, yep, or reaction of the adult.
Oops, sorry. So we've added some of our own as well. I think most of you have have really touched on them. Social skill deficit is certainly one. Not understanding or knowing how to appropriately interact with someone who is trying to address a need with a child. Peer attention, adult attention, escape. We can't forget about escaping. Sometimes we know our students just want to go home, so they're going to do something that leads to transferring them home, taking them home. Some of our kids don't know how to behave any other way, because this is the observed behavior that they're most familiar with in their home or in their community. And what about lack of core behavioral instruction? Have we taught our young people how to ask for help, how to say, I'm feeling frustrated today, I'm feeling angry today? So that's really important when we're looking at prevention and Tier 1 instruction and overall implementation of Tier 1 fidelity.
And Robin, you touched on it before too, not just our core for our students, but also the lack of our staff training.
Lack of staff training is really important. And if you've not considered any trauma-informed professional development, it may be something to consider for the future, so that our teachers and our administrators and anyone who interacts with our children, our students at school, can really have a pretty good idea of what and how trauma can impact our young people before they even walk through the doors.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to think about the research, the thoughts, the pieces of trauma as Robin's presented about, while we get into what can we do to help here? How can we intervene? So first, to really talk about that, we're going to go over this escalation cycle. This is from, I'm sure many of you have seen this. It's from Colvin. There's actually a handout, and Therese just put the link in the chat box for today's session. There's a box link. There will be 4 pieces. One is our PowerPoint in a PDF version, and one is all about the escalation cycle for your reference. And we'll reference the other 2 here in just a little bit. So the escalation cycle, think about a student who you have seen escalate, or maybe you've had experience with escalation. I think we all probably can think of one, if not more, during our time in the classroom, interacting with human beings on a level at home, anyone that you might know. So we have this piece of escalation cycle where the intensity grows over time. So we first start with our calm. Then often a trigger happens. It could be seen, it could be heard, it could be felt internally. We're going to talk about some triggers in a minute. An agitation happens. Then it really accelerates. It peaks there for your students or yourself or others. Then we can start to de-escalate the situation and recovery. But the piece we're going to talk and focus on, we could do 7 different chats around this escalation cycle for you. But the piece we're going to really focus on today is that first one, calm. This is where the most work can happen and the biggest impact can be made. So we want to focus on what we can do for prevention, what we can do to help ourselves as educators, as adults, to really assist our students through this cycle. Because, I think oftentimes we get to acceleration and peak and we want to intervene and try to de-escalate. I'm here to tell you at that point, it's too late. So we want to try to get into that prevention piece at calm. So when we have phases of intervention, we really want to focus on prevention. This is where we can actually de-escalate. It seems kind of counterintuitive since you see crisis de-escalation there on the 3rd piece. We want to be at a prevention level piece before we even get to the fact where we have to be in a crisis situation and we're de-escalating, which look very different. And we're going to run through some of those too. So first we want to understand some basic functions of behavior. I hope this is going to populate for us. There, now it's coming, which is a little slow. So we first want to know that every behavior happens for a reason. And we want to think about how are we addressing our behavior proactively. Students or adults, anyone wants to get and obtain something. We address those things that set up and set off behaviors. Build more appropriate ways. That's where we're thinking about our Tier 1. We're asking how are those strategies being built in and teaching the ways to reinforce it. Apparently, my things are disappearing on us here. When we're looking at It's like the ever-moving avoidance behaviors. We want to do essentially the same things, right? Address those things that set up or set off, but we're looking at how are we looking at avoidance behaviors? And we want to look at these things proactively. How are we teaching a new strategy and reinforcing at tier 1 our levels to help support those? They disappear now? Oh, there we go. All right, this is our third piece in the box folder for you to download. It's called an ounce of prevention. And I've highlighted here in the staying calm, number 1 piece of the escalation is this foundation of teaching, of prompting and rewarding. So our prevention, how we stay calm in the escalation cycle, is to have a lot of these pieces already in place. So how are we aligning our school-wide expectations to the routines that we do in our classrooms? Are we rewarding our students tied to those expectations? And are we providing pre-corrects for situationally inappropriate behaviors, these triggers that we've talked about, where we get into that agitation stage and acceleration prior? How are we using proactive prompting? There are some environmental and instructional modifications that we really can easily think about if we know some of our triggers are closeness or being around. We want to escape that teacher or those peer interactions. So let's look at assigned seats. Let's look at how are we using proximity control. Some of the time, I think as a previous classroom teacher, when I would hear the word use proximity control, that would mean go to the student. Sometimes that also means stay away from them. So I found sometimes the teacher, my own behavior of getting too close to the student would increase as a trigger, and a student who might not have been in an agitated state would immediately go into that. So this is a great resource for you to think about and share with fellow teachers about how to think about staying in calm through prevention.
And Lauren, this is actually a really nice printout. So it might be something that you consider as part of your regular professional development when you're orienting your new teachers to classrooms, when you're talking about posting expectations and rules. This is a little bit of, I think, a useful guide for our teachers, kind of a nice reminder.
So how can we stay in calm? It's great for Rabbit and I to say to you, great, let's do these things, but what does that really mean? Well, there are some really easy, low-intensity classroom strategies that are all about prevention. First, we want to think about how are we actively supervising? Are we sitting at our desk? Or are we up and walking around? Are we interacting and engaging with our students or our staff? Remember, not just about our students here. Are we using appropriate praise and instructive feedback whenever we're providing opportunities to respond with our curriculum and instruction? Is it engaging? Are we having pacing that is appropriate for our students at the time? And are we providing choice and preferred activities? I think one thing we keep harping on, and we probably will continue, is are we actually teaching our pro-social behaviors that we want to see happen? So when we're thinking about these prevention pieces, there's even more for you around preventative classroom systems. So if you're saying, I would love to be able to do these things, here are some resources for you. Classroom coaching guide around instruction, curriculum, how to set up your environment. These are great separate chats that really go in depth for you around those pieces. We also have an MTSS classroom coaching guide available for you to review. These are going to help you to stay in that calm phase of the escalation cycle through our prevention. Yes, this takes some work, right? This is not something that's going to just be an easy thing. We have to provide that prevention strategy in our classrooms. All right, we told you we were going to talk about you as an adult, because sometimes I think it's easy for us to think about how we change our student behavior, but adult behavior change is the hardest thing. So what are some things that you can think about to stay in the calm phase? And all of you really touched on the adult interactions in your examples. So some things to think about. How are you as an adult, a classroom teacher or administrator or district staff or other state leader, etc., human being, right? What are your own triggers? What are those buttons that really grind your gears when they get pushed, right? So we have to think about what are our own behaviors that cause irritation, and what about those vulnerable times? If I haven't had my coffee in the morning, I know I'm more likely before 10 a.m. to be easily irritated. So that is something I need to be aware of. Always have to be thinking about how are we able to keep our own self when we are being the teacher, the adult in the instructional period. We want to also think about how are we going to address those triggers? So how can we avoid them? What can we do to help us? So thinking things like taking deep breaths, counting to 5 before responding. One of my favorites, what we tell our students to do often is delay your response. You don't have to provide an immediate response, I think, although sometimes as adults we feel like we do. But practice kind of what we're telling our students to do here as well.
And Lauren, along the same vein, when students are acting out or they're not following the expectations in the classroom, when the teacher recognizes that.
So once we have finished thinking about some of those preventative, what Robin was getting at is making those relational pieces with our students. So there's another great resource here for you around student-teacher relationship building. The link is built in on the PowerPoint, but that interaction is really going to help you to stay in the calm phase when a student does escalate. I'd love to tell you that if you do all of these preventative things, no student will ever escalate in your classroom, or no adult will ever escalate in your presence. And we're unfortunately not able to tell you that because that is just not reality. So when we're thinking about how can we leverage some of those things, the building of our relationships with our students, doing a feelings check-in is a great opportunity to help. So if you're thinking about this feelings check-in on a scale of 1 to 5, there's an example for you, and just giving a hand raise during class. If you know it's during a time or you're changing activities, and that happens to be a trigger for a lot of your students, unplanned or surprises can often trigger some adverse situations. How can we do a quick check-in and then follow up privately? But that's really the leveraging of your student-built relationships.
And going along with that, a great time to discover how everyone is feeling is during those morning circles and morning check-ins. That's a great way to gauge, where are my students today? Who's struggling? Who's really in a good place? But who do I need to really focus on? So not only checking in with all students, but zeroing in on that student that might need a little additional support for that day.
So when we've got ourselves in check, we now want to start thinking about, all right, what do we see when we're in this calm phase? So I'm trying to be a calm adult. How can we make sure that we're seeing our student being in the calm phase? Well, we can often see, right, what are we looking for? That there are students following your rules and procedures that have been taught and modeled and rewarded, as an example of the kudos on the bottom. We can see students interacting positively with your peers and adults, cooperatively and academically engaged. Can you name any other things that you might hope to see in a classroom where you see students being in the calm phase?
Zones of regulation is being used in Citrus County throughout the day. So they do the zones at the beginning of the day, throughout the day, and again at the end of the day.
Great.
Oh, that's terrific.
It's a good way to think about being calm, for sure. And regulating ourselves when we aren't.
Great skill.
Yes.
Great skill.
So as anything else comes in, feel free to share. We're going to keep going and talk a little bit more about that student behavior. So just like ourself as the adult, we also want to start thinking about identifying student triggers and really having that all-knowing self-advocacy and self-regulation of students. Student examples might be things like conflict with adults, with peers, those ACEs things that Robin covered earlier, hunger, conflict at home. What's really helping there is things recognizing students when they've been taught to use and stay calm. Great, thank you. So we as adults can help to identify student triggers, but we also really want to help our students to learn how to identify their own triggers and use things like a calming strategy or talking about prevention pieces. We want to think about how we're addressing those triggers. So once we kind of know what they are or have a general idea of what they are, we want to think about this cyclical piece around when you remind a student or provide a pre-correct or prompt, then it becomes the procedure is routine. And once we've seen the procedure occur, the routine occur, we can reward, and that becomes something that is really easy. Hint, hint. This is what we do in Tier 1 PBIS as another prevention strategy. Using visuals and nonverbals to remind students are huge here as well. Other prevention pieces, environmental adjustments, changing your location prior to non-preferred activities, move to area of classroom with different peers. What's really important here, and I think sometimes we don't always think about it, is getting the student's voice in this, having a conversation about how can we help your trigger when an unplanned activity happens, or a non-preferred activity or a disruption to our routine happens. How can we help you to stay in the calm zone and not get agitated, or recognize when you're starting to get agitated?
So we've had a couple other suggestions come in. Christy noted that the app called Calm, C-A-L-M, is offering a free service for classroom teachers. So that's a great opportunity to take advantage of those guided reflection strategies and modules. Crystal also offered a calm down corner with a journal where everyone can just kind of go in there and reflect and regroup and then rejoin instruction.
Awesome. These are great things and really help with, again, that prevention piece to stay in calm. Another way as adults we can help is that pre-correction. And we've talked about it a couple of times. And it's a pretty simple thing to think about doing, but sometimes I think it's so simple we forget about it. So how can we provide a successful pre-correction? And there are some guidance here for you. So strong reinforcements. Have we taught the expected behavior? Are we developing a plan to remind students about the expected behavior? What's our plan look like around pre-correction? And do we have an opportunity for students to give feedback? Again, that involvement in your student voice when we're thinking about it.
And you know, Lauren, that student voice is so important. Sitting down and having a conversation and recognizing and helping the student recognize those triggers, but then to actually process with the student what it feels like inside. Ask them to describe what it feels like. And then the visuals are also a really good tool that I've seen used with students many times. So they can pick out like maybe a cat and the cat faces. You see a calm face, you see one that's getting upset. You see a cat like showing their teeth and ready to pounce. And so helping that child identify, well, where am I right now? And what do I need to do in order to calm down so that I can begin to self-regulate my own emotions?
Or is the cat the agitation? Because I would not want to see a cat face.
Well, that is true. So we let the students choose what face they want to use. Yes.
And that's great to think about here when we're talking about our interactions with our students. So modeling that communication, as Robin was just talking about, ask our clarifying questions, build on what has worked. And someone did notice it earlier as well about avoiding those power struggles. There's a great blog post about from Edutopia around avoiding power struggles or diffusing power struggles. And there's a link there for you as well. I think it's an easy thing that we can get into for you. And you'll see our fourth piece here, or excuse me, our third piece is that another reminder of that ounce of prevention, where it really talks about how we can build those student and teacher interactions to help with prevention. So when prevention isn't enough, right? Sometimes we have this, we're starting around our environmental planning, these teaching skills, these are the things we've just been talking about. Sometimes prevention doesn't always do the trick. It may help in a lot of situations. However, we also think sometimes this de-escalation might need to take into effect. So how are those prompting skills? Are environmental situations happening? Sometimes, though, those still don't do enough, and we have a full-on escalation, and the cycle happens. So how do we respond? Well, we respond by making sure our environment is safe, and we can prompt calm as much as we can throughout the response.
And in those situations, it's really important for adults to remain calm, because when you, as the adult, start to escalate, whether it's your body language, your proximity, your eye contact or lack of, your stance, all of that can impact what happens next with the student. So you modeling and remaining calm is difficult and challenging, takes practice, because we automatically want to react to those kinds of situations. It's kind of a human automated reaction until we really begin to practice the calm.
Yep. So when we are in that piece, what are some common practices you've used to de-escalate your students' behavior? So type some things in the chat box, and we'll give you a couple as they start coming through. What are some things that when a student is in that escalation period or has agitated, how are we helping? What are some common practices that you've used? Wait time.
Nice.
Safety care, which has a help prompt wait strategy. I am sensing a theme with the wait time here. Give them space. Active listening.
So another strategy came in, a timeout teacher. This allows one teacher to send a student to the teacher next door to maybe give them a break and help them calm down. Thanks, Jeremy, for sharing that one.
It's kind of like our chill out room, which we just shared here too, our reflection room.
Tara shares that using positive comments when speaking to keep the tone positive and moving towards your goal.
So as you continue to share them, thank you. Please keep them coming. We've put a couple up here for you that we've heard. CPI is a big one across the state of Florida, which has an entire, I think, half day or day at this point now on just de-escalation strategies, which is excellent.
And that can be done for not only high-risk areas, but there is really, many of the districts are now using that as general staff development, so that everyone at school has that has contact with kids has an understanding of de-escalation and how to, first of all, prevent those escalating behaviors, but when you get caught up into something, how to maybe back away.
Yep.
The buddy system was something that one of my districts uses, especially when they have new students coming in. We don't know everything about a student when they're new to our school or to our district. So maybe some kind of a buddy systems to help so the student feels welcome and supported, kind of starts to break down some of those fears, those immediate fears of, oh no, I'm in a strange environment. This isn't going to be good. I'm going to get upset. I'm going to get angry. If they're exposed to that friendly, welcoming environment first, maybe we can help ease that situation for them and prevent some escalating behaviors.
Excellent.
But I think it all really does boil down to also making sure that effective classroom management is in place overall, whether or not they are a child coming with ACEs or not, just making sure that the classroom is welcoming and the school is welcoming. One of my schools that really specializes in students with traumatic backgrounds has really revised their intake process, and that they go through a triage system. So the students aren't introduced into general class rotation or into an everyday routine until they get to build relationships with significant people at the school. Whether or not it's the administrator, the guidance counselor, they're going through maybe a day and a half of just really getting to know the student getting to know adults that they can trust in the environment.
I love that. That's because, you know what, sometimes we can talk all about ACEs, we can talk about trauma prior, but sometimes we have students and adults that have unknown things that happen or agitations that occur. We just have bad days and things get to us. Mm-hmm. So how do we have those prevention strategies in place already waiting for them? Absolutely. So when we did tell you, we're going to give you a little bit about that, the de-escalation. So we've done a lot of prevention. We know about the background. What happens when all of that isn't enough or something happens, right? Well, then we can start thinking about a pretty simple strategy of verbal de-escalation. So this is a targeted intervention for use with students or staff or others who are at risk for aggression. We want to talk about using that calm language and other communication techniques to diffuse, redirect, or de-escalate a conflict situation. You all have hit on the majority of these things: motivation, giving choice, setting limits, refocusing or distracting, and empathizing. That listening piece and the wait time is very important when we're thinking about de-escalation. This piece of de-escalation, we even have an entire handout that Teresa's put into the chat pod, as well as is available on the box around verbal de-escalation. So thinking about what are those first prevention strategies, but we hit that agitation and some things start to happen. So how can we give space? Help the student to feel heard. Then if it advances to crisis or aggression, how can we then support other students? It's really often unsafe to intervene at the peak of crisis and aggression, but we can be safe by supporting other students at that time. Once the student in question or the adult or the person in question is down to tension reduction, we can help that student to still feel heard. The listening piece is really, really important. And then we're looking to restore our relationship. That oftentimes something there was broken and we might need an additional support piece.
So Lauren, along with the giving space to support other students, many of my districts talk about how they have a plan. They know that there's a student that has triggers. They know a student tends to escalate. And so the plan is to remove the other students from that classroom and provide a safe environment for them so that the student that is in crisis is not at risk of hurting other children, and they have their space. Yeah. So they can work through that cycle. And I think the other piece I wanted to add was restoring that relationship afterward. It may take some time to really sit with the student and to process, but I think it's important for staff people that were involved at all with that escalating behavior and the process of de-escalation that they meet and talk about the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence. So go through that whole ABC process and then to really self-reflect what happened that could be maybe addressed differently in the future, what happened that could not be avoided, what happened that could be avoided, what were our reactions that could have been different, and then to write that into a plan to really start to address future interventions and prevention strategies with a particular student. So now you're doing some real, individual planning to help support the student.
And you bring up a really great point here too, Robin. When we're thinking about processing this, we also need to think about how did that impact the teacher or the adult in the situation. Often we do jump right to our students, but remember we talked a lot about self-identification of triggers and self-identification when you're escalating. How can we then support and restore the adults that have been impacted and influenced in a crisis escalation situation?
And again, that's where restorative circles or other restorative practices come into play so that the student can return to that classroom and start at ground zero again, doesn't feel the impact and the consequence of their actions prior to that day. It has to be a new day. So how do we restore and repair the relationship? And yeah, I think that your point was spot on. The adults are impacted just as much in these kinds of situations. Sometimes there's guilt, sometimes there's self-blame, sometimes there's just feelings of inadequacy and really struggling with that whole frustration of not feeling like they have enough tools to deal with their students. And I think that's why we sometimes hear, the student doesn't belong here, doesn't belong in my classroom, doesn't belong in this school. And unfortunately, we hear that, and it hurts because we know that that's coming from a place of frustration and feelings of inadequacy, and it's so important to address.
And that's really why we're covering so much prevention strategies today, because we want to be able to build your toolboxes to be able to address any of these types of behaviors, crisis situations prior to have those strategies in advance. Absolutely. So what we want to reflect on here is that there is a conflict cycle. Behavior escalation can be cyclical. Just as Robin was talking about, there's many influences here. So when something happens, that stressful event occurs, student or adult might feel or have a reaction. Then there's an observable behavior, and someone reacts. An adult, a peer, that feeds this cyclical cycle that creates, either increases the stressful event or helps to decrease by staying in that calm situation. That can really help to break that cycle or form it to continue and continue and continue to escalate. So when we're thinking about, this is a great, the life space crisis intervention. This is a book on conflict, the conflict cycle. If you're interested in it, it's a really great resource as well. So we want to end with a couple of reminding thoughts and things that we as adults can do to manage our personal stress. So some things like reframing our thoughts. Sometimes we think things like, that student is a monster. This is getting so ridiculous. He'll never change. Well, how might we be calm in this and think, the student is testing to see where my limit is. My job is to stay calm and help him learn better ways to address the situation or to behave. I'm sick of putting out fires. How can we be calm in our thoughts? We're reframing and thinking, I am in control. I can handle this. I will help to get into a more appropriate behave. We want to think about how we're reframing our adult pieces to be in the calm stage when it's really easy to be in that personal stress. This is one of my new favorite quotes, and we're actually going to end our content on this slide here as a reminder to think about, again, reframing the way we think about escalation, the way we reframe and think about behavior and prevention. The children who need love the most will ask for it in the most unloving ways. That was from Russell Barkley. You might have seen it around on social media a lot. And then this is a really great way to think about this, bringing it back to our ACEs conversation and trauma and the triggers that students are bringing to school, oftentimes also our teachers are bringing to school. So it's hunger, sickness, homelessness, something that's happened, a conflict at home, something on the bus, on the way, trying to get to school, all of these various things that are seen and unseen. And the student says, can someone help me with these? I'm late for math class. So how are we reframing the way that we are providing preventative interventions and support before we even get out of the calm piece of our escalation cycle, and supporting our students at Tier 1, our students at Tier 2, and our students with our most intensive needs at Tier 3. So with the last couple of minutes, we'll have you with our contact information, so it's in your flyer there. But we've mentioned quite a few previous chats that whether it's some trauma-informed care, we have trauma-informed 1, trauma-informed 2, we have restorative practices, we have some additional restraint and seclusion, reducing use things.
Principles of behavior,
principles,
another good one.
Behavior basic. We have lots of really good prior chats. So we wanted to give you some ways to find those. And also find this one. If you have found that this is a great chat that you want to be able to share out with some of your teachers or other people at the district, various friends, etc., how you might want to access this. So if you're going to our flpbis.org, our website, and scroll down to the PBIS chat schedule, then you can see this year's TA chats. They will be up, linked for you, and there's also the previous year's chats available as well. And finally, here are the live technical assistance chats for this year. So we've had, today is our second chat of the year. If you wanted to, we had a really great one about 2 weeks ago on school-based coaching, how you're getting started around that. And it's already on our website for you to go back and reference. And our next one is pretty important.
Yeah.
It's going to be changes to the model school criteria. That will be September the 4th at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. So please plan to join us. We have another restorative practices one coming up, as well as some Tier 1 parent and student perspective pieces. All right. Well, thank you all so much. We'll stay for a couple of minutes. If anyone has any last minute thoughts or questions, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for bearing with us as we practice our calming de-escalation strategies throughout the chat as well.